Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to bring you my argument for why we need to get out of 20-man Mythic rating and maybe something close, at least, to 10-man Mythic. Now, if you didn't realize, back in the day, there used to be 10 and 25-man doing pretty much the same raid, but it really started limiting the design of the raids. It started making some fights insanely easy for 25-man guilds, some fights insanely hard for 10-man guilds, and vice versa, just because of having more people to deal with certain mechanics, having more of a certain mechanic, having certain classes being really powerful, and you have a larger roster to be able to multi-class or spec swap or whatever. It was a whole bunch of problems. And so they coalesced into 20-man, and it caused mass chaos all over the place with like 25-man guilds lobbing people, 10-man guilds trying to like merge together and failing. It was all kinds of chaos. But it ended up with the 20-man world that we exist in today, and I believe now is actually going to be, or should the next expansion as it comes along, which is when they could probably do this, is when they should trigger another event of this mass chaos for the betterment of the game. I think that we've really hit a point when it comes to Mythic rating that there's too much of a barrier of entry for where the player base is at, frequently on the outside looking in, doing normal, doing heroic, and then just stopping from a gear progression perspective. We've already seen how there's recent buffs to the Mythic raid loot where you can now continuously be upgrading it. I fully expect next patch for that to continue so that the best gear in the game is still very likely to drop from a raiding content. But there's also this massive barrier of entry for players where I've completed Heroic and I love doing Mythic Plus, but in order for me to enter into Mythic, I need to commit to this team and I need to put in all kinds of work and prep before I get into these fights, before I get into the instance, and I need a hard set schedule with this team and these set players all the time. I believe going down in terms of the Mythic raid size possible would greatly reduce the barriers of entry, and I 100% think on release they should make it so that we are having cross-realm Mythic. And for Hall of Fame guilds, if you want to qualify for the Hall of Fame, everybody needs to be on the same server. Something like that, I think, would be fantastic, because for the vast majority of guilds, I don't think that they care about the Hall of Fame at all. But those that do are going to be on the same realm anyway, because they're way better organized than, the average group that's going to walk in and kill a couple of Mythic bosses, see the Mythic raid, and choose if it's going to be something they want to dedicate lots of time to, or just, a day or two on the weekend. That being said, there's a lot of issues that could be happening along the way with trying to make this sort of shift, and a lot of it exists with the game itself. On the one hand, there are a lot of classes that are just mandatory for the raid. There are two different categories I think that you could kind of lump this into. Classes are brought to the raid because of what I would call overall raid utility. This would be like their buffs, debuffs. This is like Fortitude, Mark of the Wild, Chaos Brand, all of those things. They are more, I guess you could say, passive buffs or debuffs that are just naturally applied before the pull, rebuffed if somebody dies, but you just sort of set it and forget it, and you don't have a lot of interaction with it other than that. I think a lot of these buffs are in prime position to be homogenized. I would also include Battle Res and Bloodlust in these categories, because we already saw how Paladins this expansion were given Battle Res, and it's only been a positive. I don't see any Druids or Death Knights or, Warlocks, when they occasionally cast a Soulstone, being upset that Paladin has the capabilities to issue a battle res. In fact, it's often just more convenient for them to do it because there's such large barriers or frustrations for other people to cast it. Boomkins are just going to cry about not casting, and then Warlocks have like a 3-second cast or some ridiculousness to it. And so having a Paladin, especially a healer, who's able to issue the battle res is really wanted and desired. And I don't think that, for example, giving all healers battle res, vastly increasing the amount of people that can bring Bloodlust to the table, is going to have any sort of negative impact onto the game, and I think it can only really be a positive. I also believe that when you're having certain roles that are always sort of responsible for one area or another, like Resing, for example, you're not really losing out by having healers having battle res. In fact, it's kind of their responsibility, or it's often given to the responsibility to do those kind of things. On the other hand, there are very iconic class abilities And this is the part that I think kind of stuck with people when I had the conversation on Twitter, was there's certain class abilities that should never be homogenized. And I think one of the most important ones is making sure you're subbed to the YouTube channel for all of our content. But also things like Priest's Master Spell, Mind Control, Lock Gateway, DK Grip, all of those things have had impacts over the years in making fights a little bit more dynamic, a little more interesting. We saw like mind controls in Jaina, where you'd mind control guys and jump them off the boat or something in Phase 1. You know, DK grips are absolutely imperative on Ziskarn to be able to successfully round up the robots. And it would be really bad for the game, I think, if you started making, you know, hunter pets. Spirit pets can now make a spirit portal so you can port to one end to the other, just like a warlock can. Like, yeah, that's goofy. They shouldn't do that. That'd be pretty cool. But those are things that would absolutely decay the interest or appeal, I think, of playing a warlock. And so they should not be going after any of those iconic abilities. As a result of that, I don't know if we'd actually be able to exist in a world where you could have only 10 players in Mythic difficulty without actually having a lot of variety taken away from the game. That said, it might be something around 12 or 14 players or something along those lines, which would still be a significant reduction in the amount of people you need just to be able to get together and play the game. It also would be a lot tighter knit of an environment, and also a lot easier to be able to flexibly choose who you want to be able to bring to the encounter when you don't have to have every single buff, debuff applied with things like we mentioned before, Chaos Brand, Mark, Fortitude, etc. When it comes to those encounters and how they'd look, well, think about something like Sarkareth, for example. Sarkareth is having maybe some benefits of like grips with some of the ads, but again, you kind of keep them rallied together constantly. And there's the Master Spell when you have double debuffs that are going to be out on Mythic difficulty. But otherwise, I think this encounter is really notable for having maybe a little lighter on the mandatory side. You have Master Spell, you have Lock Gateway gameplay, and then a lot of times it's the entire group and how they're positioning themselves. And it feels almost like a Final Fantasy fight if you played that game in raids, because a lot of times you're in the same position, moving in the same direction, standing in the same spot, and it becomes extremely scripted. A lot of the encounter design has been sort of following that formula going forward. I think we saw it quite a lot as well in like things like Sire Denathrius, where there's a bit of dynamic gameplay depending on, you know, some of like the blade positionings. There's a bit of dynamic gameplay for some of like how you're picking up your buffs on things like Sarkareth. But I don't think that reducing the raid size is going to just immediately lessen the appeal. Probably the most imperative of things is managing how many class buffs and debuffs exist, and making sure that you're not eroding the iconic class abilities that are absolutely necessary for high-end raiding. But I think that we're really at a point where certain specs are not brought to raids because they lack those iconic abilities, or they lack the class buffs and debuffs altogether. And so having a change in the amount of people that are going to be brought to a raid, and having that at the exact same time that you're revamping and changing what buffs and debuffs are existing in the game, I think is absolutely going to be a good thing that would have great impact, whether it's for raiding or for Mythic Plus. I can't tell you how many times we've seen, now keep in mind our Mythic Plus meta right now is bonkers, but generally how many groups are just stuck waiting for Bloodlust, stuck waiting for Battle Res, stuck waiting for the Poison Dispel. All of these little abilities that feel like roadblocks to be able to organize your composition, whether it's raids or Mythic Plus. Eroding some of the uniqueness of these things, I think, actually has positive effects. I think it had a positive effect with Paladin having Battle Res, and I think it would have a positive effect if more specs had like Lust. Same thing with Battle Res, with healers were having battle Res given to them, where your like Poison, Disease dispels, all of those things would be a lot more normalized or standardized, so that you're not forced into these specific things because of the flavor, I guess, of the dungeon. To the end of utility, there's certain specs that are bringing damage reduction naturally, like DPS, DKs bringing anti-magic zone, warriors bring rallying cry, that are all really impactful, that could also make it so that they're brought in these lower raid sizes over other specs instead. Why wouldn't this also be a good time to start simplifying some of those effects as well. Is this going to be the end of, say, DKs if they're not bringing Anti-Magic Zone and it's a tank-only ability? Same thing with like Rallying Cry, so that every tank is bringing some raid-wide or party-wide damage reduction, and that's sort of the role buff that they're going to be bringing to the table, while healers are always going to be bringing battle res to the table. Maybe like range are bringing some type of absorb effect to the group. Melee is going to be bringing some kind of debuff or something along those lines, and you can start breaking up some of the effects of, say, like Fortitude, Mark of the Wild, Chaos Brand, Mystic Touch, all of these things, and making it based off the role, and then that is going to push the specs to be able to have, or to push the game to have certain amounts of melee, certain amounts of range that you're bringing because of that utility option that they're going to have, rather than being forced to bring the DPS warrior, being forced to bring the Wind Fury totem or something like that, because they're the only ones that can bring this extra sort of ability that's going to make all the difference in the world. Personally, I've always really enjoyed my time back in 10-man raiding. It was where I really started learning how to raid. I felt like it was a very tight-knit environment. I was a lot closer with the people that I was on the team of. I think it'd be beneficial for these esports orgs and these world-first teams, instead of having to manage rosters of 30-something people, that you would be having 15 or 20-something people you'd be managing instead. I think it would be better for the average Joe to be able to get into the content and to be able to experience the content when, hey, you just need to like open up Group Finder and find 1 or 2 people because you already have a community of 10 or 11 that you're able to build upon. I think there's a lot of potential here to opening up some more of the gates for Mythic to allow more players to be able to interact with the game at a higher difficulty level, because I think if they're going to try to keep Heroic as accessible as it is, as easier to complete than I think we've seen in the past. I think notably some like the Shadowlands raids were quite a lot more difficult on Heroic than they are in Dragonflight. Then you kind of have people wanting and hungering for a little bit more in difficulty, but unable to find their way to get it. So I think decreasing the raid size on a Mythic difficulty level permanently across the board would be fantastic for the game. I don't think they're going to be able to do anything with Flex or anything along those lines. But I do think that there's going to be maybe slight changes to some of the encounter design, but really heavy changes to utility that is brought to the table that would also just have good benefits when it comes to a Mythic Plus environment. Let me know what kind of thoughts you guys might have for some of the role-specific utilities that could sort of balance out range, melee, and still keep it valuable for like which tanks are bringing which debuffs. I think that'd be probably one of the hardest things for them to figure out. But like all things, if they have the time, resources, energy, and they really care about it, they can make those things work for sure. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.